Shall we start, Carl, or do you want to hang on?
Well, I suppose we should, yes. I'm sure we'll get a couple of folks flying in here as usual.
Yep. Do you have any announcements to make before we
Oh
introduce?
yeah, I got a couple.
I figured you probably did.
Yeah. So first I'd like to welcome a couple of new members. We have Ken Scudder. Uh, is Ken in the room there? Can't tell because I don't see him here on Zoom. Anyways, Ken joined us earlier in the year as a guest in April, one of our meetings. He also attended the Littleton shoot with David and has since become a member. We appreciate it. Welcome, Ken. We also have Nancy Shepard, who's recently joined us. Uh, Nancy was in a competition meeting last month. Also went to the Littleton excursion with David. And welcome, Nancy. We're glad that you're here too. We do have one guest that I see here in Zoom, so I'll talk to you first, Max. If you would, unmute and if you'd share what type of photography you do, how you found us, those kind of things.
All right, I'd be happy to do that. I would guess you can hear me all right.
Yes.
I've been doing photography since high school, but not seriously, ever. Over the last couple of years, since I've retired, I've been traveling around in an RV camper van, and I've been taking pictures of whatever I find out there. And I'm looking for a resource that I can learn how to take better pictures. I've got some nice pictures, but I'm sure I could do better.
Awesome. Well, hopefully we can be that resource for you. Tonight you'll be learning all about car photography and editing, and we have a lot of other resources available. Plus, when you join our club, we do have club members who are mentors. We can connect you with so you can get some personalized instruction too.
Right.
So, welcome, sir. In the room at Littleton, or excuse me, in Lone Tree, do we have any guests there?
No guests.
Okay. Just all the regulars, huh? All the cool kids. All right. I just want to quickly go through a couple of upcoming meetings that we have. September 20th, next week, we do have that critique session with Doug Johnson. Unfortunately, as of yet, I've gotten exactly 0 images for that. The deadline for it is Sunday evening. If you want to participate in that critique session, Doug has graciously offered his time and talents. He did a macro presentation for us a couple months ago. Some of you may remember him. So if we don't get enough images for it, I'm just going to cancel the thing, unfortunately. But I hope that we can get some people to participate. David, yes.
Carl, will you be recording that session?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And then the other thing I wanted to mention was our competition meeting this month. It's an open competition. It's also our BFF night, which is Bring a Friend to Focus. Todd suggested that a month or two ago. Basically, we want to, spark some more interest, get a few more people. Certainly, y'all have friends who are photographers that you could bring in, and maybe we could boost our membership for the rest of the year and for next year also. So if you've got anybody in mind, please bring them. And we'd love to see, everybody at Lone Tree. This isn't, like I said in my email or newsletter, it's not an invite a friend over to Zoom to crack a beer with you or have some ice cream like Andy's doing. We'd love to have people show up, and we're going to start early too. We're going to start 6 o'clock. We'd love to have people show up at Lone Tree so that we can socialize a little bit. Here you go, Andy. So you socialize a little bit and get to know them and maybe get them into the fold. And the last thing I'll mention, David and I had a little conversation, a little email exchange about the folks who participated in the Littleton outing on August 30th. A number of those people had expressed an interest in sharing their images with the club. Obviously, we do have a private Facebook group where you can do that, and a few people have posted there. But we'll go ahead and carve out, 15, 20 minutes or so for anyone who wants to participate. We'll do that at the October program meeting. after Cheryl has done her presentation on shooting the cranes in Nebraska. I will get in touch with everybody who attended to the Littleton shoot and give you some more details, have you send me images, et cetera, et cetera. We'll get that all worked out, but plan on, showing up at that October meeting to talk about your images that you send in to me. That's all I have. David, to you.
All right. Thank you, Carl. Our presenter tonight is Dan Greenberg, and many of us know Dan because he's been in the club for quite a while, far longer than I have. But Dan is a photographer specializing in fine art, automotive photography, and he's based in Parker. He's been photographing vehicles of all types at car events and salvage yards, at custom portrait sessions, and many other places and situations for over 30 years. His work has been published in car magazines as well as in his own series of self-published and ever-growing series of car art books available on blurb.com. His interest in cars and photography began at a very early age. Beginning at age 12, he learned how to repair cars while working at his father's gas station. His interest and obsession with them started then and continues until now, and presumably the future. Dan's love for photography began in 5th grade. By his early 20s, the two interests came together and the continual search for beautiful and interesting automotive subjects began. Other photographic interests include travel, architecture, wildlife, and many others. Dan, by profession, is a computer software system architect developer and is the president and owner of Freedom of Information, Inc. Dan has been a member of Focus for 19 years, since 2004. This presentation will cover how Dan finds cars to photograph, how he photographs them, and mostly how he edits them in Lightroom, Photoshop, and Photomatix HDR, using plugins and filters from Topaz, DxO, and On One, and with a wide variety of filters. The techniques shown in this last part will be of value for all types of photography, not just automotive. So Dan, with that, why don't you take control of the screen?
And let me ask you just a question, because like I said, this is a big screen. One of the things that I was going to say is this whole, thank you, David, for that nice introduction. And basically all that is correct. One of the things that I was going to say is that tonight I'm going to do the where to find vehicles part. That one won't be all that long. Then how to photograph them and what I look for when I am photographing things. And same thing, that will be a little longer, but not too much. I think between both the first two parts, it's going to take up 30–35% of our presentation. And then after that's the editing part, which will go on forever. And we probably can't even leave. We probably have to stay till about 10 or 12 o'clock. So we'll get through as much of it as possible. There is going to be a printout in a couple days for this. I have so far like six or 7 page printout here that has a lot of the same stuff. What has the same stuff I'm going to be going through. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be showing you a bunch of things that, just a bunch of little tips and stuff like that. And then some of it, I'm going to be showing you more detailed stuff. Now, one of the things that it's important to realize is that I know not everybody out there has Photoshop. I know not everybody out there has Lightroom. Some people work with different things. Everybody's at various experience levels. One of the things I realized, and this isn't my first presentation. I've done quite a few of them. And one of the things about this on the technical aspects of it, I'm going to mention products and things like that. And the whole point is to get the idea more so than the specific product. And the reason I say that is because a lot of these same ideas can be done, just like everything in Photoshop or in photography for that matter. A lot of these things can be done a whole bunch of different ways. And not only can they be a whole bunch of different ways, I won't say for sure that my way is the right or best way. These are just the ways I've done things, forever. And every once in a while, I find, there's something new that comes out that makes it, easier or whatever. And so I switch methods and so forth. So a lot of this stuff, you don't feel like you have to go out and buy all this software. A lot of the stuff I'm going to show you tonight, you can't even get anymore. And again, it doesn't really matter because there's other things now that, like one of the things I found out, I'm a very big Topaz user, both new and old Topaz stuff. And it turns out Topaz has, I didn't even realize this, it's been 3 years, shows you how embarrassing this is. I get set in my ways here, but a lot of the Topaz artistic stuff they quit doing. So in other words, basically Topaz went from a company that was probably one of the two leading companies in making creative filters and creative filter packages to a company that now only does photo quality apps. So in other words, the only thing they worry about now is things like denoising, sharpening, enlarging, and stuff like that. And they've kind of narrowed their business down to that, which is unfortunate. I've tempted, once I found that out, I just found that out about 4 or 5 days ago. Because when in the process of making this, I thought, well, all the filters that I use of what are called classic Topaz are filters that now they don't really have anymore. But what they did have is a thing called Topaz Studio that they launched afterwards, that you could buy those same filters or get them in sets and add them to Topaz Studio. Well, it turns out even something new like Topaz Studio and Topaz Adjust AI, for instance, both of which are pretty new products, when 2-3 years ago, they quit making them. So at any rate, there's other things we're going to cover that you can do a lot of the same things in Nik. You can do a lot of the same things in On One. And so I wouldn't get too worried about that. I'm just going to show them to you and expose them to you. And the whole idea is getting you to know that there are certain techniques that we're going to use in Photoshop, no matter which filters we're using. And then also that it gives you ideas on, I'm one of those kind of people that a very large percentage of my finished images were not necessarily thought of 100% at the time I shot them. They were things that later on, just by playing with stuff, I figured out, oh, I want to try this or try that. And that's kind of where this all goes, okay? So like I said, this won't be an in-depth course on how to use Lightroom or how to use Photoshop. It's going to expose you to techniques. And then if you want to learn and get good with the techniques themselves, what I expect you to do is you can keep, this is going to be recorded, so you can watch it over and over if you need to. And then a lot of this stuff, people, the specific techniques, the specific tools and so on and so forth. There's probably YouTube videos on all of it. There's a lot of it where I forgot the thing that used to be Photoshop User Magazine. I had a subscription to it forever and ever and ever, and I forgot what it's called now. I've just been grandfathered in, but they have billions of instructive videos on things. So the specifics, without getting too involved in everything, I'm going to show you stuff, try to keep it as uncomplicated as possible, and hope that you get the idea of how we go about things, okay? And like I said, the important thing is to concentrate more on the overall, some of these overall techniques than the actual filters and stuff, okay? Okay, so with that, I will go ahead and start. And what I'm going to first tell you about is, we're going to talk about where to find vehicles to photograph, okay? Most of my images are from either, I basically have two kinds of images overall. I have pictures of dead cars and I have pictures of fancy cars, and so the cars that are both, the biggest source of both of those are either going to salvage yards for the dead cars, and then going to car shows and car events for the other ones. Now, the best thing ideally is I've also done like, now people know me all over the world. I have, I've done classes like this in Australia and other places over Zoom or WebEx or whatever. And I've sold books and pictures and everything, like literally everywhere. And the kind of things that I like to show people is like how you get these pictures. And a lot of them, even if they don't look like it, they're from car shows. Now, the ideal thing is then, I do get hired to do custom photo shoots, both, by people and sometimes by magazines. And those kind of things are the ideal thing because you actually have control over stuff. One of the things that's hard for people to get used to when you're doing this kind of photography is that, unlike most other photography where you decide, okay, landscapes, you just have to make sure you get there early enough to get a good light, or late enough or whatever. A lot of times, 95% of the time on this kind of stuff, you have really no control over anything. Okay, you have no control over the light. So a lot of the techniques I'm going to show you tonight are things that just basically combat bad lighting conditions. And again, that's the kind of thing that if you think about when you're on vacation or when you're doing something else besides cars, if you think about the fact that you might, be on a tour or something and they take you to a really nice spot, but that same spot, you're showing up there at 11:30 a.m. or something when the light is terrible, the sun's in the wrong direction, whatever, okay? I'm sure you've all been there. You've all seen that, okay? anyway, so a lot of you have been, I'm sure you've been to a bunch of different situations where you have, you're only going to get that one chance to take that picture. Okay. And yeah, it'd be nice if you could wait till sundown. It'd be nice if nobody was in the way. It'd be nice if there are no tourists. A lot of this kind of stuff, car shows are exactly like that, only probably worse. Okay. Everything's in the way of everything. So anyhow, let's start with the other couple things that you might find cars like. I love if I find dead cars or abandoned cars that are not in junkyards, that off by the side of the road. Like David's going to find some in the Palouse right now because I found some great ones up there over time where you can get, it's a very easy picture because you don't have anything in the way. You might not have the right light, that part might need to be fixed, but at least you don't have a lot of visual interference. Okay. A lot of times in my case at car shows, even I get cars posed for me because I know a lot of people at this point. I've been doing the whole car show circuit kind of thing. I started in 2006. And then, continued, from now, and people know me like all over the place. They know me and I don't even know them a lot of times. And a lot of times people ask me to take pictures of their car specifically. And it's a nice situation to be in because that way you can actually move the car and get it into a better position a lot of times. And, at least have it aimed into the light instead of aimed away from the light, have it late, have people wait around till later in the day when the light gets better and that kind of thing. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is cover equipment, and equipment is actually pretty simple for this kind of stuff. Okay. Basically the equipment I use, I have a walk around lens, which is what I use probably for 95% of my pictures in both junkyards and or car shows or whatever. It's kind of your go-to lens most of the time. And that's usually essential for doing things like whole car shots, which are the hardest ones to get, obviously. And it's good for a whole bunch, close-ups and stuff to a degree as well. In my case, right now, when I was using my Nikon, my Nikon full frame, I was using 24-70. A 24-70 f2.8 was my main lens. It still is when I use my Nikon. And then mostly in that case, all the numbers I'm going to tell you about for the most part these are going to be full frame numbers. And those of you who have any kind of a crop sensor know, that if you have, let's say a APS-C sensor, and I say it's a 15 millimeter lens for full frame, that's going to be the equivalent of a 10 millimeter for APS-C. In my case now, I'm using Olympus pretty much exclusively, and that's a micro four thirds sensor. And the sensor basically is 1/4. It's a 2x crop. So that means my main lens that I use now is a 12-100. And so the 12-100 is like an incredible lens for things like this because it ends up being a 24-200 f4. And like I said, I can keep that on pretty much all day and get everything with it. Okay. But I do usually have, nowadays I don't necessarily carry a longer lens than that, but you do need one a lot of times. And the longer lens that I used to use a 70-300 on my Nikon. A lot of people have 70-200s, that kind of thing. And then I have a wide angle also with me. And wide angles, I try to use it as little as possible because it'll distort cars. It's a little harder to work with, but a lot of times you absolutely need it. And so wide angle, if you have like a 16-35 zoom, for your Canon, Nikon, Sony, whatever, full frame. In my case, I have an 8-18 Panasonic, which is the same thing as if you double that, that's a 16-36 millimeter. So it's the same kind of thing. Then some of the other things that are really essential, and it always blows my mind when I go to a car show. And remember, one of the biggest problems you're going to have with things like cars is glare, reflections. I can't believe the number of times I see people who are supposedly, it's one thing when you see what I call civilians who don't know anything about photography, just shooting with a camera and they don't know what they're doing. But I see tons of people, not tons, but enough that it makes me wonder, where you see people going to a car show and they're using whatever kind of lens, but they don't have a polarizer on it. You do need a polarizer. It's kind of, as far as I'm concerned, it's essential. I never take it off, except for very rarely I take it off. But for this kind of photography, you definitely need a polarizer. A couple of the other things that I always have that I find very handy, and I'm famous for actually, is I wear a knee pad all the time. That's because a lot of the shots I shoot, I have to get down low for them. About when I was in my late 40s, a long, long time ago, I didn't wear knee pads. And one time we have a real big show that's always at the end of June in Pueblo, Colorado. And it usually has to be 100 there, 95, whatever. And like an idiot, I did this a number of times with it and never had any problem with it, but I kneeled on the, blacktop and somehow did nerve damage to my knee. And that lasted for about 2 years. And every time my knee touched anything at all, sent me through the ceiling. So the lesson learned there was not to go without a knee pad, as much of a pain in the butt it is. I also wear a floppy hat, not like not any kind of a hat like a baseball cap or anything like that. And the reason is because if you have a baseball cap, I used to, but every time you if you want to take a vertical picture with your camera, the rim of the brim of the cap is always in the way. Okay, so that's another thing I try not to do. I have that floppy hat. Again, it works really well for me. And then the other thing that's also a really important thing is if you're going to wear sunglasses, you have to make sure you don't have polarized sunglasses, because the minute you put your camera up to your eye to look through it, you're not going to see anything, especially if you have a polarizer on. Okay, so that's I think enough on that. Our next part, how I photograph them and what I look for when I am. Okay, so one of the things I just want to tell you a couple general notes. My advice is to take a picture even if you're not sure about it. One of the things I still see a lot of people doing is they still have what I call a film mentality. And a film mentality is that, well, you don't want to waste any shots at all because, film's expensive, you have to process it, all these kinds of things. You only have 36 shots or whatever, before you have to change. And you have to get out of that habit when you're shooting digital. If you have to shoot 20 shots of something to get it right, or to make sure that you're covered, is a better way to put it. I know that sounds sloppy, but I do that all the time because usually car shows, especially, you're really in a hurry almost all the time. Shots come and go within seconds. It's kind of like, it's in a way worse than sports or other action photography, because you may have something lined up, and if you don't take it right away, almost always something's going to get in your way, either another car or people or something. So you have to be on the lookout for all that. So it helps to be able to operate really fast. The other thing with going one more note to going back to the equipment part is if you're starting out at this, you're best off just taking like I said, a walk around lens and something like a 24 to 105, or in my case 24 to 200, or something along those lines is ideal. And don't take anything else, other than obviously spare batteries and things like that. Because one of the other things people make this big mistake of, they take most cameras, especially if you have a more modern mirrorless camera and it has image stabilization, and during the day, you're not going to need a tripod. And tripod's usually a big liability because of the fact when you're walking around all these expensive cars, and some of them, like I said, are very close together, and it's real easy, plus you're paying attention to everything, to accidentally scrape your equipment against one of those cars. And if that happens, especially if it happens to damage to a paint job, remember that people get a little bummed out about that, because some of these paint jobs can cost 30, 35, even $50,000, if you can believe that, for a paint job. So I always am very, very careful about that. You have to really be careful about when you're walking around, not to hit anything, not to touch anything, that kind of thing. Okay, so anyhow, as far as how I shoot, obviously I shoot always in RAW. To me, that's like the only way to do it. It gives you so much more flexibility later on. There are people who, there's sometimes when you have special modes in your camera and you have to do a JPEG, but for the most part, if it's up to me, I always do RAW. I've seen people, they don't want to do RAW because they worry about processing it too much, but most of the time, the processing of a RAW, if you just want the basic look of a picture, is very easy. The other thing I would say with car shows, and this is kind of true with a lot of things, but if you get there early and stay late, it's ridiculously better than the whole rest of the day. I get probably 85% of my really good pictures at the beginning and ends of shows. The reason that happens is because, first of all, in the middle of the day, when everybody's gotten there and everybody's parked, all the cars are close together. There's not nearly as much space in between cars or anything else like that to get a good angle on them. There's not very much in the way of, there's more people have their chairs out and their awnings out and coolers, and there's just more people always around the car, kind of stuff. So if you wait till the later part and the early part, there won't be as many cars there, because at the beginning they're all just getting parked. And I find that a really good time to take pictures, because I run around a lot chasing cars that I see it just parked and it's a nice car and it's in a good spot, and I run real quick to get over there, because before another car can park by it, and also right when somebody's getting out of the car before they've gotten all their crap, their folding chairs and their whatever else that they're going to sit around their car all day out, I just ask, can I take a quick shot real quick and have them out of the way and get the shot, and you're in and out of there like a nothing flat, and it doesn't bother them that much, and that way you've got a picture that doesn't need nearly as much help later as some of the other things you're going to do. The other thing is, I always look for cars when it's a car show situation or a junkyard situation, either one, where cars are kind of close together. And you look at the sun, and you always want to make sure that the shadow from one car is not partially overlapping another car. And the reason I say that is because that's an extremely hard thing to fix. In my experience, there might be somebody out there who's really good at it somehow, but I'm not. And I've been trying it. I've done this a while. I know it's a tricky thing. So that's one thing I always try to do. If I see a thing where a big shadow is like taking up half the car, I just don't shoot it. Because that's one of those things I know it's going to be a long, long time before anybody comes out with software-wise for anything like that to work. Anyway, if it's just barely touching the car, I can fix it, kind of thing. But if it's like a big piece of the car, that's tricky. The other thing I do is I always shoot in aperture preferred mode, and that's just me. I always set my f-stop and stuff like that. And obviously, like a lot of other kind of photography, you want to try to use as wide open as you can and still get sufficient depth of field. Okay, so usually with like again on full frame cameras, if I'm at f8, like f8 or low, or when I say lower, I mean like f8, f5.6. F8 usually handles everything I need to. If like I'm looking at a car that's at an angle or diagonally, if it's a car that's parked, perfectly flat in front of me, then like f5 or 5.6 or f4 will work. Okay, and you just experiment with that and see how that when you're doing it, look at it and see, did you get enough depth of field? Is the back of the car or whatever still sharp and in focus, that kind of thing. And then did it with any luck at all, did it blur out the background like you wanted to, or as much as you can? So that's the kind of thing I do with that. Another thing I do pretty much, especially in real high contrast situations. So you're going to notice that when you go to a car show, a lot of times it sucks as far as the way the lighting is. It's bright blue. There's no clouds in the sky. There's harsh shadows everywhere. There's glare everywhere. The polarizer will help you get with the shadow, with some of that. But overall, there might be too wide of an exposure to actual, it's getting better. Newer sensors are much better with dynamic range than older ones were. But even then, you kind of want to be able, hopefully, how to use your histogram. And if you take a picture and you look at your histogram and it's blown out at either end, then you know that part's not going to be recoverable in post-process. Okay. So basically, what I usually do is I have one of my presets on my camera set to do a 3 exposure bracket. So I shoot as though I might have to do an HDR thing with it later, even if I don't need it. You can always throw it away again, but if you don't have it in the first place, you can't get it back. So I'll usually take, I have one of my presets and I can just flip the camera over to that real quick. And if I look at it and it's really contrasting, there's a lot of shadows and whatever, I just flip it to that, click it, and my camera is like ridiculously fast, so all the pictures stay in. I don't bother using a tripod or anything. I just hold the camera steady, fire, get my 3 shots, and I'm on my way. And the 3 shots I do is usually one underexposed, one perfectly exposed, and one overexposed. And you'll thank yourself when you do this later, because you'll realize that a lot of times to get the car perfectly exposed, you're going to blow out the sky, and vice versa. So this way, you have the ability to add all that together, using a bunch of things can do HDR now, including Photoshop and including Lightroom. I still do most of mine in Photomatix, which I'll give a quick demo of later. But the bottom line is it's a handy thing. Again, it's preparing yourself to be able to shoot later and get, be able to process something later and get a really good picture out of it. Okay. Usually, and things like white balance, I usually leave that set to auto. Okay. And that's usually fine because again, that's one of the other beauties of using RAW. You don't really care about your white balance all that much. It gives you a good hint to start out with. And the only time I ever change it from auto is if I'm deliberately trying to do a color cast. So for instance, if I want the thing to look blue, even though the actual picture won't look blue, I could set it to like, a tungsten white balance, for instance. And even the raw will, when it first comes up with the computer, will look blue, but it really isn't. Okay, but it gives you a hint of what you were thinking about when you shot that. Okay, so far so good. The other thing that's important with car shows is that cars, a lot of car shows can be real big. I mean, the biggest car show I've ever been to had 14,000 cars, which is the Street Rod Nationals. And that's like unbelievably sensory overload, real hard to do a lot of stuff because there's so much there. And then a lot of smaller shows and whatever. One of the things that, especially on a bigger show, but even on a smaller show, it seems to be the case that I look for cars. I walk around a lot and I try to go around the perimeters and off the beaten path of the car show, because a lot of times, everybody wants to park in the middle, at the hot spot where there's going to be the most foot traffic and all that kind of stuff. And so that area is usually crowded, harder to get angles on cars and so forth. Meanwhile, there's all the people who kind of get there late or just don't want to park there. And they're parked off on the edges and stuff like that. And a lot of times they're all by themselves. Nobody's there. You walk up to them, you can spend all damn day taking pictures of it. You can get a lot more variety of different angles on it. So my big thing is always look around the edges of a car show, and especially, at any time, but especially when the car show is right in the middle of it. Okay. Another thing with car shows, a lot of them are 2-day and 3-day affairs. And that means usually they might have, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So what'll happen, Saturday is always the best day because that's when everybody's there. Everybody comes for Saturday. A lot of times people leave early on Sunday and they're not there. I still stay anyway, because again, if on Sunday a lot of cars leave, all the ones that are still there are going to be much better targets. And Friday is kind of that in reverse, where people are just getting there and they may not get there until late in the day. So the few that are there earlier, I won't say few, but there's sometimes depends on the show. But the ones that are there earlier are usually not quite as bunched up, and it makes them easier to shoot. Okay. So, and then some of these other things are going to be kind of obvious. You want to shoot with the sun behind you if possible, have the car's face or whatever you're, trying to do lit up. Again, there are tons and tons and tons of times where I don't do that. I go ahead and shoot. If I get a picture of that, at least compositionally, I like it, I shoot it even if the lighting, the shadows in front and so on and so forth. Okay. So one of the things I'm going to do, I'm going to start showing you pictures now that off and on here. So one of the things I'm going to do, as far as cars at the end, wait for cars kind of towards the end of the day and look for them at the edge of the show. Here's an example of that. This car here, this was in Pueblo. And this car here was earlier in the day. I did buy it, and every single space you see, there's a car on the left, on your left, there's a tire there. And then on the far right, you see the back end of a 67 or 8 Camaro. And when I was there earlier in the day, the car that was on the left wasn't there. There was another car much closer. And then from the other side of this car up to that Camaro, there was 4 or 5 more cars. Okay. So obviously, if I can get a picture like this is a good picture. I mean, this is a really good picture to if you can get something like this, because of the fact this is a very relatively simple picture to fix. Okay. And so what happens is, through cropping and doing some other stuff, whatever. Now watch the difference. Here's that, and here's what the ending result was from it. Okay. And you see the difference there. I cropped it. I did a bunch of other things too, which we'll get into later, but I cropped it. I got rid of, right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. I should do this a different way. But where these doors are, where the Camaro is, where the tire is, where these dirt marks are down here, I got rid of all that. Okay. And then basically, and also another thing to be aware of is you have to look for, see this right here. There's in the window, there's 2 entry tags. Okay. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit too. So that's one thing. Another thing, the next one is when I was telling you about the shoot with the sun behind you if possible. There's a lot of shots like this one here. Luckily, it was a little overcast. And everybody can see this, right? It's kind of a weird pink. And this is, like I said, I don't worry. This is a RAW. And those of you who don't use RAW already need to know one big thing about RAW. And that is, I've had a lot of people saying, oh, my pictures come out terrible when I shoot RAW. And the reason they do is they're not really terrible. It's just that everybody gets used to seeing JPEGs. And when you see a JPEG in your camera or in your computer, either one, always remember that that picture has been processed, okay? It has been post-processed, but in the case of a JPEG shot in the camera itself has internal software and it did the post-processing, okay? That same picture, here it is. It's got a lot of things. It's got crap in the background, whatever, ugly lawn, but this is what it looked like fixed up, okay? And you can hardly tell that the sun was in the wrong position. I mean, you still can because of the shadow and everything, okay? So you get the idea there, hopefully. Another thing, going back to, you know, a lot of cars here is you want to do things where you look for spaces to exploit on a, you know, where, in other words, you look, even when cars are parked all over the place, you're going to find stuff like this, like a whole bunch of cars were lined up. There's cars here, but this car here, as you can see, it's like, it's actually in a pretty great space because there's somebody here, there's stuff here in the foreground, but none of it, except for this one little, the bumper of the 36 Ford behind it, is touching the car at all, okay? And you're trying to get stuff like that all the time, where the less stuff that is touching the car that you don't want in the picture anyway, the less stuff actually touching this car, the easier it'll be to edit later, okay? So basically, you do something like this, and then again, this picture here became that, okay? And so this is what it looks like after it has obviously gotten rid of all this stuff. The exposure is being corrected, although the exposure wasn't really that bad. Remember, this is a raw picture right here. Even though it says edit TIFF, it's not. I just made, all this was a raw that I did nothing to, that I drew a bunch of yellow lines on and then made it into, you know, this so I could demo it. But at any rate, this is what that picture turned out like. So part of it was achieved by getting rid of things, and part of it was achieved by, you know, other techniques like, you know, cleaning up. There was reflections in here and stuff like that I cleaned up, okay? The other thing is you need to be really, really patient, because what happens a lot of times is with lighting and with people and everything else, a lot of times I'll get lined up. If I see a picture I really want, and again, this doesn't apply to junkyard. A lot of this stuff applies to junkyards, but this doesn't, because normally at a junkyard, you're not going to have a bunch of people running around in front of you. This one does appear like here. So one of the things that's important is a friend of mine, or a friend of my wife's actually, that she met on a cruise, bought this Mercedes Gullwing at Barrett-Jackson. So this picture here is from 2008. It's an old picture at this point. But as you can see, this was at the Broadmoor. They had a Concorde Elegance at the Broadmoor for 2 years. And they invited me down because they wanted to make sure I took a picture of their car. Of course, they're nowhere near it. You know, the Gullwings are up. There's crap all over it. There's shadows everywhere. The lighting is just terrible, you know, as you can tell. And basically, it stayed like that the whole day. So Concorde Elegance type car shows are kind of very hard for two reasons. One is the fact that there's a lot more garbage around the cars, you know, some of it that you can't move, like, you know, they have tags in the grass and all sorts of stuff blocking part of the car and whatever. And then a lot of times, you know, the people at those tend to draw a lot of what I call civilians, and civilians are the ones that they don't really pay attention. If you're photographing, they walk in front of you. They don't know what's going on. Sometimes they do know what's going on. They still walk in front of you and whatever. So this is what it looks like earlier in the day. And what happens is I knew I had to get a picture of this car, and all day it was sunny and crappy and everything else. And then later on, this car did win an award. And then what happened is the owner, I was trying to, you know, of course, he's too busy talking about his car and everything else, and he's never buy it, but he ended up reparking it at least in a blank spot, okay? And so one of the things that was good about this is that notice how the lighting on this one. And what happened is whenever there's really bright lighting, but you at least have, you know, clouds, you should always be paying attention to see when you're going to get cloud cover. So this picture is literally the only what I consider exceptional picture I got during this show. The reason it was is because I kept looking up. It was pretty much a cloudless, bright day, but they're all of a sudden at towards the end here. So two things happened. A, the cars around it were all gone. And B, this cloud got in my way. This basically lasted all of about 15 to 18 seconds. Okay. And then it was back to being glary and shadowy and all sorts of stuff. Okay. And so basically I was able to get this picture. And then also by aiming, coming in from a high angle, you can see up at the top, you see some people's feet and some other stuff, but right above the edge of the picture, there was 20 or 30 more cars, 900 people, whatever, all sorts of people just mulling around. But by aiming down at it, obviously it cleaned all that up. And then later on, okay, so that's what the raw exposure looks like. And then this is what I ended up doing with it. Okay. So again, I did some grass treatments on it because I didn't want the, grass to look, like that. Okay. That's one thing. Okay. Now the next thing is, the other thing I look for too is I look for opportunities where the car itself is usually going to be used to block out a lot of other things. This was a really hard one, and I'm not going to go ahead and tell you the whole thing about this. This is a picture that was an extreme amount of work and difficulty to fix. Okay, so it went from that to that. Okay, but one of the things even with this picture, by the fact I'm down low like this, if I had been standing up, there is like ridiculous amounts of stuff. There's other cars, there's other canopies and all sorts of stuff all over the place. I did go through, and again, because this is the kind of car, luckily I caught the owner right before he was just getting ready to leave. And there was a big sign right here blocking off this part of the picture. It's a sign that tells all this history about the car and all sorts of other nonsense. And he had just put it away. And I said, is it okay if I get a quick picture before you get in and take off? And he said, yes. So I took this, and knowing that it's going to be a lot of work. Okay. And one of the things that I also used to do a lot of, so this, I won't bother showing you this one fix wise, because this is like way too much work and way above what we're trying to do right now. But one of the other things to notice about this, another thing I often do is I'm shooting low. Okay. And notice I don't like this compositionally because there's too much foreground and not enough at the top. Okay. So what I've done is I left enough room around it so that I can later on crop it to do this, okay, to make it a little lower and a little, better. And I do that all the time, especially when I was shooting with a full frame, because, in order to do this, everybody always asks, well, why don't you just aim the camera higher to start with, be at that same position, but aim higher so you have less ground in your car, compositionally, you're better off by being closer to the ground. But the problem is with that is, especially when you're in like this, you're usually at a relatively wide angle. I wasn't too wide at this one. I was 38 millimeters on a D700, so full frame. But the problem is, if you are doing that, it still makes the car distort a little bit. Okay, if you've ever played with wide angle lenses, and all of you have, you know that tilting a wide angle lens up or down makes a drastic difference on the distortion level of the car. So a lot of times when I'm doing full frame, is I just leave myself enough room to do what I want to do and later on, knowing that I will reduce some of that in post. Okay, so that's another thing I look for. Yeah, and so a lot of other things too. Like I said, if you block out stuff, it helps tremendously. Okay, another thing I'm going to show you in another example, and we'll show you more detail on this one. This was a junkyard example showing the same thing. So I had a picture that I had this picture right here that was in focus about 5 months ago. I forgot when, but I know I entered it. And what happens is this picture, this is the environment this was in. There's two of these cars. They're 1938 grams, 38 and 39 grams. This is the one that I have a picture of here. This is the other one. They're both next to each other. As you can see from this picture, they're like, here's one over on the right-hand side. You see part of the other one with its door open. Here's the one we took a picture of with its door open. Here shows you again how close together they are, and other cars are in the background. And then here is the picture I finally arrived at, because I was able to get in nice and close here. And as you can see, there's some things color-wise and a bunch of other stuff I had to do, but the only actual editing out I had to do was right over here at the right, okay? Just by getting it posed right and being real low like that, because the car itself is blocking out almost everything else, okay? And so that's something I do a lot of times, okay? So it's something to be aware of, that you might see something like this, that when when you look at it from the top, and the same thing with car shows, you'll see just tons and tons of background clutter. Okay. And so just like I said, by getting down low, the other car, I made a picture out of it as well, this one here. And so this one here ended up becoming this picture, and that's the composition. And then you can see there's cars on both sides of it. And then that's how it got fixed. Okay. Anyway, so that's another kind of thing I always try to look for. And whether it's a car show or anything else, I try to look for ways to use the car itself to block stuff. Another thing I do is, I didn't used to do this as much. I do it now pretty much all the time, is let's say, a lot of times if there's a really high contrast situation, okay, if you take a good picture and you get the car exposed, the sky is going to be blown out or pretty much unrecoverable. Now, I can obviously do HDR for that, which I have a lot of times, but another thing I do is I just take pictures of the sky, you know, right when you're there. That way they'll sort with your pictures. You take pictures of the sky, and then they're correctly exposed and everything else, and you can use those later to fix the picture of the car by changing the sky out if you need to. The other thing I always try to do is, you obviously have to pay, especially, this isn't as big of a problem with dead cars because they're mostly not as shiny, but you have to pay a lot of attention to where you have reflections. Okay. And one of the things that makes car show, especially shooting very hard, is that when you're getting ready to shoot a car, obviously you polarize it first to, you know, get it as good as possible. But polarizing doesn't always get rid of everything. Okay. And sometimes you don't necessarily worry about getting rid of everything in every case, but a lot of times you want to get rid of a lot of it if you can. And so what happens is you have to look at your look through at the exposure and look and see if you notice any really bad things that are going to be in the way, that are going to be hard to remove as far as the reflections. Okay. So one of the things that we'll do a demo on that in a little bit too, but you'll see kind of what I mean. The other thing is, like I said, you look around by going low and doing some of these other things, giving yourself enough space on the side, taking pictures of skies, taking pictures sometimes of the lawn so you can use it later, or background trees or whatever, in case you need them to fix something. You'll have enough stuff usually to work with. Okay. The whole trick is to try to get cars like here. Let's go back here and go to try to give yourself as little to fix as possible. Okay. So one of the things here, this picture, again, this is just a raw, so I haven't done anything with it yet. But this picture here, you can see there, this red 32 Ford is right by this, I forgot what this orange thing was, and then there's Mercedes in the background. Okay. Now, without me doing anything else, I went, and first thing I did is went lower, and look what happens to the orange car. Boom, gone. By just changing my angle a little bit and whatever. And so now the other nice thing is, okay, so I got this building in the background, and I got the Mercedes. Okay. Or Honda, I'm sorry, it's not a Mercedes. To me, Hondas and Mercedes are exactly like anyway. I don't know anything really about cars. But at any rate, that car's back there. I know it's going to have to be eliminated. And the one thing that's cool is, okay, see, this background is relatively uniform. Okay. There's not a lot of complexity to it. So what happens is later on, when I want to, I can select select along here and select along here. And then I'll show you these stuff like this in a bit when we do the processing part. But I looked so that I could say, okay, this is going to be relatively easy to select out of here. And then if I need to, I can cut and paste basically, or use the stamp tool, take stuff from here and copy it over to here. And I'll make a nice background out of that. And so then this car will have stuff that I like behind it. Okay. So you try to look for things that you don't have to fix too much of. And anything that you do have to fix, you hopefully, like going back to, like, for instance, one little difference here. If you look, do you see where this first doorway is? Notice how there's space. And I made sure of this because, when you first come down, when I first started lining this up, this door was intersecting with this headlight. Okay. But by doing it this way, it makes it so much easier to fix because of the fact that I don't have to sit there and do a selection around the headlight. All I have to do is do a straight line, select down before the headlight, select, and by that, let me show you what I mean real quick. I'm going to open it in Photoshop. Okay. And so basically a lot of the stuff, and we're going to cover this more in detail later, but I just want to show you that if I zoom in on this, and then I go ahead and select something very simple. And again, this is something that I do on all sorts of photography. And I don't do this just on cars. You know, I look for when there's something I don't want in a picture, I'll sit there and look to see if I can make it nice and clean and easy to fix. So then all I have to do, and I'm using content aware fill right now, but I do this and it fixed it. Okay. It got some stuff I didn't want to, but it still fixed it. And then if I use yet another tool, which is the patch tool, and I drag this thing sideways like to here, and then deselect it, it's pretty fixed. Now I might have to do some other adjustments, you know, a little bit, you know, to get it the same color and stuff like that. But either way, you see how that was easy. Otherwise, I would have had to sit there and make a selection around the light, so the light didn't get included in that. Understand? So then the other big thing is something like hood ornament shots. Okay. One of the things I do with hood ornaments is you look for something like where you can get a pretty uniform background. A lot of times you do that by, first of all, using a big lens. So here's an example. This was shot the same day, same car, same whatever, you know, same time basically. And this picture is not bad. I mean, the car in the background's far enough out to be blurred out. But what I did instead is I got down lower and just shot the same thing against the sky. Okay. And then, you know, after did some corrections and stuff to it, it ended up like this. Okay. But by doing something like going from this to going to something like this, it made it an incredibly easy picture to fix as opposed to this. Okay. So one of the things you always want to do with car show stuff or with hood ornaments, looking for things like this particular one had cars all over the place. But what I did is I thought, okay, I'll just fire down against the ground. Okay, so there was enough space between this car and the car on the right of it that I was able to aim this down here, and knowing that, okay, this is not a great background, but it's still better than a real busy, icky, whatever background. And then the other thing is I also knew that, well, this is going to be pretty easy to select. And so then later on, what I decided to do was a whole background replacement on it, not just the sky or anything else. But I took another picture that I took. It's obviously a sunset in the mountains as opposed to, this is in the middle of the fairgrounds in Larimer County Fairgrounds, which is one of the ugliest places on earth. Well, maybe not, but anyway, you see the point. And then another thing you look for with hood ornaments is you just look for cars like here, I'll show you. So something like this. This picture, what I did is the car next to it, there's a red car next to it, okay? I'm shooting this with a 220 millimeter lens, so I backed off enough that my own reflection's out of it and some other stuff. And then what happens when you do that and you get just enough depth of field to get the hood ornament and in this case the reflection, sharp. But notice how nicely the background blurred out. So I have this nice background that highlights everything, okay? And at the same time, it's going to be super easy to fix. Now, I look for this, and a lot of times you find it. Maybe you'll find a picture like, let's say there was a door. I think this might have been one at one point where there's a door here. No, this is a raw, so this is how it is. But a lot of times I'll find them, and let's say there's like going up and down right here. You have like, somewhere you'll have a line like where there's a door, the door seam or something like that. And again, that in a whole red background like this, it's really easy to select that and meld it into the background. Okay. So that's one thing I look for that. And then, like I said, later on, I fixed this picture a few other ways, but I didn't really have to do very much to it. Okay. I took some stuff out of the reflection. You always want to look for, whenever you're doing any kind of chrome stuff in your pictures, if there's any other bright color that doesn't work, like see how there's blue right here? I color corrected that. We'll do this one real quickly later, but I corrected that. Okay. So that's another thing. You look for something like that. And ideally, even if you can't find something like that, ideally, if you have a friend, ideally one who's really overweight or big, I'm kidding, but somebody who's got a t-shirt on that's like a solid color in the back, or a shirt that's a solid color, and then you have them stand in between this car and the next car, okay? And so that you have them move so that they're blocking the next car, and then what you're doing the same effect, only you're using the back of their t-shirt instead of the next car, okay? So that's another thing I've done quite a bit of. So that whole trick is, like I said, you want to try to give yourself as few things to fix as possible. Okay. So then the other thing is, obviously you want to be cognizant of the fact that there's going to always, again, at car shows especially, there are going to be a lot of obstacles. Okay. The biggest ones are usually things like the people and owners themselves, because they're sitting right by them and they're congregated around their car with a million different chairs and coolers and God knows what. And a lot of times, in my case, you know, because I can pretend I'm the official photographer, but a lot of times I just, you know, if I can, I have them move. A lot of times, if there's just a couple chairs there, I'll move them out of the way myself, take the picture, put it back in. And when I say move them out of the way, you move them out of the way, usually so they're behind the car, so that the angle that you're shooting from, you can't see them. You can move them away from the car, but then a lot of times you'll just go down to take your shot, and then you'll notice those same chairs are in your reflection. Okay, so you have to, you know, keep, you know, always be aware of reflections. The other thing you always have that's a big pain. Let's go back to this car for 1 second. Is what are called entry tags. And see already up on the window here, there's that little tag that says this car, who owns it, and you know what it is, and all that kind of stuff, and where they're from. And these are like the bane of my existence because I hate them. You know, I on the one hand, I like them because I take a quick snapshot of them so I know whose car it was. But on the other hand, I don't like them in my pictures unless I absolutely have. There's no better way to do it. So one of the nice things about doing something like this is if you position your camera so that whatever is behind it, notice how behind this you have the interior, but there's very little detail in the interior. It's just plain black. And so what that's going to do is make it easier. This isn't that hard to select. And then later on, it'll be very easy to get out of there because of the fact that it's against, you know, an area where it's not hard to replace. And whenever you're thinking in terms of replacing something, you got to remember this. The difference between something easy to replace and something hard to replace is what is behind it. So for instance, in this case, there's a plain black, more or less black surface behind it. It's going to be easy to, you know, replace that white tag with the black surface, right? But then a lot of times you'll find this, let's say that tag was on the other side of the car. This car is not a good example for that, but let's find a better one. Let's go back to, so even with this car, so let's go back and look at this one. If you look at the entry tags on this, luckily they're in an area where, see, the glare on the window is actually my friend at this point, because then later on I'm going to be able to take that out. I don't have to worry about reconstructing the headliner. I don't have to worry about reconstructing one of the back windows, okay? All of which you want to try to stay away from as much as possible. Because reconstructing stuff that you don't have pictures of is definitely hard unless you're a real good hand, you know, painter or something like that, and I'm not, okay? Most people aren't, I don't think. So the thing that's also helpful is, like I always tell all my friends nowadays, and most of them listen to me, if they're putting that tag on, it's much better if it's on the passenger side. And the reason is because think about it this way. If you look at, let's just take this Mercedes that doesn't have one on here, but let's say it had one and it was right here, it would be right here where the windshield wiper is. So the windshield wiper would be laying across it, but it would be laying across the steering wheel, okay? And if I get rid of it, then I have this whole big gap in the steering wheel, right? Because it's not going to automatically do that under anything. Maybe they'll come up with some AI at some point that does that. Right now, they don't have that. And so what happens is that's going to be a bitch to fix. And I have fixed it before, but it's really not fun. Okay, so just, you know, be aware of the fact that you want to try, you know, the other thing is, let's say let's get in closer here. Let's say the entry tag was up higher, okay? Then it was higher and it was above the steering wheel, or maybe it's just touching the steering wheel here. But if I aim up, a lot of times I'm going to have the ceiling there instead of having, which is easy to do, as opposed to all this stuff to fix, okay? All right, so then let's talk briefly about salvage yards real quick, and the general thing I look for there. There, I just look for cars. Again, I try to get cars that are as segregated as possible. Okay, so again, here's another example of something like this car was sitting kind of by itself, but as you can see, this angle, there's a bunch of stuff, and off to the left of it, there's probably hundreds of cars. Okay, but the nice thing is, by going low on it, I was able to, and it was separated far enough that I was able to get this picture, right? It's got some power lines and some other things, but those are easy to fix. And then later on, by the time it was processed and everything else, it became this, okay? And even in this picture right here, I don't think it's the final one because there's still power lines in it. But anyway, I often make a lot of versions of stuff. But the whole point is, again, always be cognizant, no matter where you are, looking for cars that are out by themselves, or they're at least far enough away from the crowd that by angling your lens the correct way or the right way, you're going to be able to get them segregated and then get a relatively clean picture compared to having one with a lot of other stuff in it. Okay. So same kind of thing. This part here, when I took this picture, this was again at a different year, or maybe it was the same year as that Mercedes. Also, this is on the golf course at the Broadmoor. And luckily, because of taking a picture of this car, I got a contract. This guy owns about 40 cars, and then he started wanting me to take pictures of all sorts of them. So, which was really cool. And I didn't know him at the point I took this. But what happened is I saw this all the way across the show, and it hadn't left yet. And again, this is another stay late thing. There were cars, tons of cars around it earlier. And when I got there, I saw it. Oh my God, it's sitting all by itself. And there's some junk over here. There's another car on the left, over here. But you can see, I just by cropping alone, I got that out. And then there's just a couple things to fix. There's this house in the background. There's this sand trap. And otherwise, it's a pretty clean picture. It's got some reflection problems. Okay. And so that picture there ended up, being like this. And that wasn't that hard to do. Okay. So again, always be kind of looking for stuff like that, to separate it out and get a clean the cleaner composition you get in the first place, the less work you'll have to do on it later. Okay. So salvage yards, same kind of thing. Like I said, you have to just look for where you can segregate things, where you can get stuff out in the open, and so forth. Okay. And now, I think we're going to do. So why don't we take what do we normally take? Like a 10-minute break?
About a 5-minute break if we do.
Okay, so why don't we let everybody take a 5-minute break, and then we'll get into processing, okay?
Dan, this is Carl. I've got a quick question about finding car shows. Obviously, people can type into Google car show in my town or whatever, but
right.
Are there, and I know that you're plugged into the community, so you hear about this stuff all the time, but if we were looking for stuff, I mean, other than the phrase car show, is there something else that we should be looking for, or some other way to find them?
No, I just usually look for car event. And of course, I know, I'll tell you something. A lot of times, if you're in a certain place and you're wanting to go with one, just, one of the things we should do is, let me put this in chat. I'm going to put my email and my website both, since they're on the cheat sheet that I'm going to give you later, but since we don't have that right now, that's my website there. And by the way, one of the things, if you ever want the website part, even if you find questions on that and you want to look through it, one of the good things about it shows you. So my website, if you log into it, let me put this up here real quick. This basically shows you a lot of stuff. And right here, do you see this one? The second one, these are all the different galleries in it, okay? So this gallery here has a whole bunch of other galleries in it, the car art galleries, which are, and then they have galleries within them and so on and so forth, okay? So there's plenty to look at there, and it shows you some of the places I've gone to, and a lot of them are still there. And this is all just black and white stuff. The actual, if I go back to the main page, this one here shows you all the car shows I've been going to in various orders. Ever since COVID, I haven't gone to nearly as many of them. I used to go to probably 5, 7, 8, 9 big ones a year. What happens, there's a lot of good ones. And actually, Carl, you're having an advantage. Places like Kansas and Oklahoma, through the middle of the country, they seem to have more than we do. We have a couple good ones, okay? We had a whole bunch of good ones too that were really excellent, that unfortunately went away. Like, so for instance, we had one called the Dirt Drags that was in Monte Vista, and it was all this kind of stuff where you have hot rods racing and cars all over the place, and just tons and tons of different possibilities for pictures, right? And like I said, you can look at this and you can comment on these, or you can ask me a question in a comment or whatever if you see something that you are curious about. So that's one place to get them. If you're in an area and you look up just events in the area, not even car events, but just events like with the Chamber of Commerce or something like that, they'll often have them listed. Okay. Another thing that I go to, okay, so there's a website called Jalopy Journal. Here, let me write it in the thing. What a lot of things I find out about, I find out through other people. So there's one called jalopyjournal.com. And within that, there is a subsite of it. You want to look for the one that says HAMB. We'll get back to doing processing now, okay? So one of the things we're going to talk about, we're going to mostly do, what I'm going to do first is tell you about some of the basic tools that I think you should learn. And these are, when I say that, they're basically stuff in either Photoshop or Lightroom, okay? And then I'm going to go through kind of like what my typical workflow is, and we'll fix a couple pictures and show you some of the things that happen. Okay. First of all, just so you know, I'm doing this on a PC. I have both. I have my laptop here, which is a Mac, so I've done it on both. Those of you who have Macs, if I say something like control something, in a Mackies, that's command something. Okay, and this is all in the cheat sheet anyway. And then same thing with alt, and alt on a PC is option on a Mac, and so forth. Okay, so some of the keystrokes that I may call out here, just beware that you may, if you have a Mac, they're going to be different. I'm just going to call them all out in PC-ish. Let's talk about the tools. The main tools I think you're going to need to know on this is you need to know how to use layers. You can't do this without, you can do things without layers, but it's insane. It's like, it's way harder. We're going to learn how to do masks. And again, a lot of this is going to be, for people who've been doing Photoshop for a long time, this is going to be possibly boring to you, but at least you'll know it's there. I'm not going to spend all that much time on it. And then, all the different tools for object selection, including some of the new stuff. And I'm using, I think I'm on the very newest version of Photoshop. I'm not positive if it's done the upgrade lately or not, but I think it has. Basically, how to do that, how to use the lasso tools, how to use an eraser. Okay, an eraser is just another paintbrush, but basically it's an eraser. How to use the patch tool, the stamp tool, content aware fill, blending modes, and things like that. Okay, there's some basic ones. And like one thing about Photoshop, there's nobody in the world who knows everything. My brother-in-law might, because he teaches it, but for the most part, Photoshop is so deep and so broad that if you don't know stuff right off the top of your head, don't worry about that. There's going to be a lot of stuff. I didn't learn this stuff overnight. Okay, I've been doing this. I probably started doing this very heavily. I started doing Photoshop while I was still doing film stuff, only for printing and things like, taking things out, getting them scanned, and fixing them and whatever. But basically, I've been doing regular Photoshop for 19 years now. So, and there was a point where there's all sorts of things that I go back to now, and I think, oh my God, I could have done it so much better. I can do, part of it's not so much, as you go forward, like I said, a lot of times, all the time, your skills are going to probably get better. And then for sure, software and equipment is going to get better, that makes things easier. And I'll show you a real big example of that coming right up. So now the next thing we're going to do is talk about a typical workflow. Okay. And so a typical workflow is I open things. First of all, whenever I take pictures, I import them into Lightroom. Okay. So everything in my case centers out of Lightroom. Then the next thing I do is in Lightroom, I'm going to balance the exposure, contrast, color, to the degree it's possible. Sometimes I don't like it in Lightroom and I don't do it there. But just to give you an example, let's go through and take like this picture here. And this picture, I think I might have already done something too, but let's just see what happens. But at any rate, right now I'm going to go in and I'm going to look at this. When you're in Lightroom, if you just go up here and right off the bat, hit auto. And this one I already did hit auto earlier. And so what happens, auto a lot of times will get you to a pretty good spot of what it thinks is the basics are, okay? And then let's say in there, you don't necessarily like some of the stuff. I look at this picture, and I think this picture here is a very clean picture to start with. The only thing really wrong with it is, it looks a little flat because of the lighting and because of the fact it's a raw. And then also it has, just see right across here, there's a reflection. The white line on the street is reflecting here, okay? And so we'll go in and fix that, all right? What we're gonna do is open it. And like I said, I did the contrast and I already cropped it. The other thing I always want to do is I usually always, if I'm going to do any cropping, not 100% of the time, but 99% of the time, I just do it in I do it on my raw first, okay? I can always get it back if I don't, but I do it in my raw before I open it up in anything else, because what's going to happen, if you open up the thing and then crop it later, then what happens is you have to, if you have to make any changes, you have to go back in, and let's say you cropped it wrong or something like that, you can't fix it very easily. And then not only that, you're also doing work on a whole bunch part of the picture that you may not need to do work on because you're going to throw it away anyway. So in this particular case, what we're going to do here, we're going to show you a couple little basic tools. And right now, I'm just going to go ahead and up here, there's a couple different things. We're going to start with the real basics, which are like the lasso tools. Okay, and so there's 3 of them. And the one, I don't use magnetic that much anymore. I used to use it a lot, but now there's other things that have supplanted it. But I'm just going to use but basically there's a reflection there. Okay, and let me zoom in on it. I'll show you what I mean. Can everybody see that? Like there's a stripe right there. And okay, and that stripe, notice there's also another one right over here. Let me do one other thing too. I'm going to do that just for demonstrating this. I'm adding a new blank layer. I'm not going to worry about that for right now, but the new layer is just so I can color. Okay, so this is not going to be part of the photograph. You see what I'm saying? And if I go ahead and get something like a paintbrush, and right here, you can see there's like another. Oh, hold on. Okay, well, anyway, the exhaust pipe is reflecting right here. I'm not going to worry about that. But you see that basically I did a selection around this. I didn't do it right up to the edge. And then I'm going to use a thing called content aware fill. Content aware fill is something that came out in Photoshop CS5 a long time ago. And it's certainly one of the best things that ever happened to it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Shift and F5, and you're going to see that whole thing is just going to disappear. Okay, so that's gone. That was a simple reflection fix. Okay, and notice there's still some more of it here. So, and I also don't recommend doing something like this. That you see how like the reflection goes across the door frame. See that? And if you do this, I'm just going to show you this. Shift F5. A lot of times it will not get that right. See, it eliminated part of the frame. Okay, so I'm going to Control Z or go backwards and do this the right way. And one thing you want to do if you start doing something and you select something and you have a lot of problems, like it seems to be doing weird things, then try doing it in pieces. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say Shift F5 to that one, for content aware fill, and then deselect it, and then go over here and do the same thing, right? And basically, as far as I'm concerned on this one, this car is finished, okay? Except for we're going to make it prettier, but basically we got rid of the things I wanted to fix in this one. Okay, that was a nice simple fix. And no matter which marquee tool you're using, you can use it to select things and then do whatever you want later. Okay, and so now what I'm going to do is the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and make this thing prettier. Okay, if you're using any tool except for Nick, all of them you have to make a new layer for. Okay, now one of the things also, even though I just did a fix there, that was a very simple one. I knew I couldn't screw it up. Ordinarily, do you see over on the right hand side you have what's called the layers palette? Okay, and I've got 2 layers there right now. I'm going to get rid of this one since I'm not using it anyway. But what happens is you go this layer, and if I want to do a duplicate layer, I just do Command or Control J, and it makes a duplicate of it. Okay, and then the reason I'm doing that, and I label that, I'm going to go ahead in this case pretend I did it for that first thing before I fixed it. I call that fixes. Okay, you always want to try to do fixes as early as possible. Okay, the same kind of thing with denoising. So a lot of times I'll denoise directly from Lightroom using either, I've got all of them, Topaz or DxO, or whichever one I decide is good at that point, or On One. I use all 3 of them pretty religiously, pretty frequently. That's because they sometimes work better in certain situations. I'm not going to get into that right now because it's too detailed and too, it depends on what your situation, what your picture is like. But at any rate, I made a fixes layer. Okay, now layers, you can turn them on and off. I'm going to make another one here to do something artistic. Okay, so I'm going to go into, in this case, Topaz. All right, and I go up to my filters menu and I go down to Topaz, and I'm just going to go ahead and at this point use something very simple, Justify, which doesn't exist anymore, but we can do this in Nick as well, and I'll show you that in a second. And basically go down here, and I've made a lot of my own presets, so there's a lot of them that come with it, and there's ones that I just like better because I did it myself. And so here I just did that. Okay, and so that you see what it did. It helped the contrast, helped the color, maybe too much. I'm not going to debate that at this point. Usually I'll fine tune it a little more, and then I hit OK. And it saves it. Okay, and so then I'm going to say something like, I always name my layers, and this is important too, because if you name a layer later, you're going to come back it's great right now. You know exactly what you just did. But once you start getting a bunch of layers and a whole bunch of other stuff, you'll sit there and think, oh my God, what did I do? Okay. And you won't remember what you did. So Topaz adjust. And I actually don't even say Topaz adjust in my case because I know it's Topaz adjust. I just go ahead and say dramatic, more colorful, balance. And like I said, these will be different for everybody, but you write stuff like that down. Okay, now you notice that after I did this, it brought to light a lot more. See, there's more reflections up in here. And so the same kind of thing, you just do it over. And this time I'll use a different selection tool. I'm going to use the patch tool. Okay. And when you're doing a flat color like this, from this to this, and again, I'm hoping this is all coming through on Zoom that you can see the little details here, and I pull it down and it does stuff like that. And it just went ahead and cleaned it up. Okay. And you do just different things like this, where you take one thing that's the same color, basically, drag it from one to another, and it's going to fix it by just taking this. And what happens is, you see up here, you have a choice that when you drag that little loop, you drag your selection to the place that you want to take from. Okay. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? That's a kind of important thing. It's simple, but it's important. And notice that if I turn this back off, it goes back to whatever, right? So you didn't change anything underneath it because you made a new layer. And the same kind of thing is if I want to now try something different with that instead of this one, and let's say I just, for the hell of it, want to do something in black and white. And in this case, I'm going to use a Nik one, and Nik one will also make the layer itself. So if I go in and I go to filter, and then go to Nik, and then I go to Silver Effects Pro. And I'm not saying this is like the right thing I would do necessarily. I'm just saying, giving you an example here so you can see how this kind of thing works. Okay, so then you get a black and white one, right? And so you can sit there and look at stuff, and we'll just choose one here. It's one of my favorite ones. Go to there. And like I said, again, the whole point on this is not to show you exactly what happens with how to use all of Silver Effects, because this could be an entire class all by itself easily. But one of the things you have up here, you have this kind of thing. You have a black and white, and then you do something like you want to make the red show up more or whatever. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do. But what else would I do on this? Probably do something like this, brighten the white walls. Another thing I always do is I look at tires, and I think of tires, and I always like to brighten, make sure the white walls and things like that are nice and bright, because it makes the car pop a little more. So see that? Definitely that way there. And then again, with Nik, I can copy this point over here. And so that way both my tires are done, and whatever. I'm not going to do much else. I'll put again, these are just examples. I'll go through and where's my vignette? There we go. Vignette, I'll make a slight vignette on it. Okay. Again, there's a billion ways to do this. There's other tools, whatever. So now I have a black and white in a second. So there we go. We have a layer, and we have a layer mask. We haven't done any masks yet, but we have a layer. Okay. And so now let's say, and again, this is a dumb example, but it's a nice, easy one. Let's say I want to do something like, I want to make something like where the car itself is in color, but the rest of it's not. Okay. And so one of the things we're going to do, we're going to introduce you to layer masks. Layer masks are like, if you don't have them, you need to learn how to use that more than anything else for any other kind of photography that you're ever going to do. And it makes things way easier, because what it lets you do is something like this. I'm going to go ahead and click here, okay? And then what I'm going to do, see this little, down here, there's a little deal, it's a square with a circle in it, with a white square, a white rectangle with a square. You can hit that, and there's other ways to do it too, but it makes a new mask, okay? And that mask lets me erase or unerase through this layer. Does that make sense? So the black and white layer, if I turn it off, is underneath, there's the red layer. And if you think of layers like they're just pieces of paper laying on top, different versions of the picture laying on top of each other. And if you move one or get rid of one, you see the one underneath. Okay. So there you have that. And then what happens if you select the layer, or the layer mask, I mean, and then you go through and you get your eraser tool and you start doing this, okay, you can just erase, and you can make it a bigger eraser. And the bigger, you can make any of the tools bigger or smaller by using the square bracket keys. Okay. And again, don't try to worry about all this now, but let's say I'm just doing something like this, right now, okay? And right now I still haven't had to really select anything. And what happens is if you see over on this, the mask, see the black area? The black area shows where you have erased already, okay? And I don't want to do the wheels. So if I don't want to do the wheels, I can do one of two things. Right now I wanted to unerase that. So I can go up here and choose, no, when you're doing an eraser, you have to change it from white to black. And now it'll unerase, okay? And like I said, don't worry about memorizing that, because once you do it once or twice, you'll remember it, okay? I'm going to do Command Z to fix that. And then I'm going to go, if I hit X, by the way, X changes it back and forth as well. And that's the fast way to do it. So anyway, we go ahead and erase through certain things. And you do that by, you know, if you're doing it the really crude way, you just do this, right? You go through and you keep erasing and you're careful, and so far so good, okay? Except notice right here, I accidentally went over, so I hit X again, and then I erase the window because I want the outside to still be black and white. Okay, so basically you're doing something like this, okay? And this is, again, I'm doing a crude job of it right now because I haven't really made a mask, or I'm using a mask, but I haven't really done like what's considered a good selection, okay? So that was one way you can do it. This is just doing it totally by hand, okay? And again, it's something on simple things that works fine. On anything with any complexity, it's a big pain, okay? But as you can see, it's kind of getting me to where I want it to be, you know? And I kind of look at this, and one of the things I always tell people too is if you're going to do a complex selection, okay, and you know, it's going to take a little work, and this one will take a little work also, because remember, I've got to do things like go in here, erase stuff like this without hitting the water, and you know, go up here and just to give you an example, I'll do this sloppily. See this? I got the blue. I did too much. I didn't want the blue from the water behind it. So I had to make this smaller, you know, and so forth. And then same kind of thing here. The whole point of all this stuff is that you want to try to do this once, because the one thing about selecting stuff is the single hardest thing there is in Photoshop, as far as I'm concerned. Making your mask and selecting stuff is the hardest thing. It's by far the most time consuming, okay? And a lot of times you won't necessarily need to do it. I'm just saying, when you do, you do. And it's good to do stuff like this, okay? And whatever the case, and you start a selection like this, okay? And later on, you know, you finesse it as you go. You don't have to do the whole thing all in one step. But basically, you get to a point where it's kind of selected. Now, this one was easy, relatively speaking, because the color contrasts are, you know, it's bright red, and the only thing that's bright red is that. Now, let me show you another couple ways of selecting things. So we're going to close this. I'm going to make a copy of this layer, and the way I make a copy of this layer is just like any other layer. I hit the Control key and J, or Command and J, or you can go up to the menu and do it. And what happens, I made a double layer, right? And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close one layer. I'm just saving that. It's still there. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this mask. I'm going to get rid of the mask on this one. I'm going to make a mask a different way. Okay, so I'm deleting the layer mask. And I'm going to close this, okay? And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, using the red layer, there's a lot of ways you can do different kinds of selections on this. So the thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to use another tool, which is called the magic wand. And this has been around forever and ever. It doesn't mean it's the right way or only way to do it, but I'm just going to show you a couple different things. So if I hit, you have a sensitivity up here, and it says, or tolerance of 20. So 20 or 25 is usually a good place to start. And you see what it does. I'm going to select that and see how it went ahead and selected what it thinks is within 25 basis points or whatever, 25 shades. I don't know what the 25 really means of that red. Okay. And then what happens up here, I can keep adding to my selection. So I can click here, add more red to it, click here, add more red to it, click. And also, oh, by the way, one of the other reasons up here, there's a thing called continuous. Okay, and let me hit continuous, turn it off for a second. Let me go back and start this over. Notice, by the way, I have my history window showing over here. Let's say I want to start that over, so I can just go back up to here, okay, to where I made the layer. And now I'm going to go ahead and, since I turned off continuous means that it'll only select colors that are within the range of, you know, 25 points that are touching what you're touching. But if I hit it now, notice how it selected a whole lot more stuff all over the car because there's other things in the way. And see that one there, it was too much because it selected stuff that was black. So what we're going to do there is we're going to reduce the tolerance. I was wondering why it would select the blue. And so what happens now, you see it only selected reds. And then I'm going to select more reds. And then select more reds and more reds and more reds. Okay. And then let's say I have all this. And this isn't perfect yet, but it's getting there. Okay. And then right there, Control Z, as you see, when I did that, do you see all the little white dots? And they're called marching ants. And right now, you see how that went down, and whatever color I just selected there, the sensitivity was too broad, and so it started selecting the tires and stuff. Because right here, I tried selecting right here. And what I'm trying to do is build the whole selection. So that area is very easy to select otherwise. So I'm just going to go back and take this tool, my polygonal lasso tool, and have it so it's adding to the, by the way, up here, you have these tools: add to selection, subtract from selection, make an entirely new selection. And what happens is now I can go through and pretty quickly, as you see, I can sit here and select all this, you know, and just go through here and whatever. Okay, so we have a lot of that kind of stuff, and you can see the car is getting pretty close to selected. And it's pretty clean selection too, okay? And I'm not going to worry about making it perfect tonight, but it's like, obviously, you do this stuff like this and you keep doing it till it's got everything selected. And sometimes it takes one step and sometimes it takes multiple. But either way, you get something selected, right? And then when you're all said and done, you go back up to your black and white layer right here, okay? And notice I switched layers, so I'm back up to this one. I turn this back on. I now selected this layer. And if I go through and hit this circle, notice what it did. It selected the wrong part, okay? So I'm going to undo that. And what happens is I'm going to have to invert my selection. So what happens is I can do one of two things. I can either hold the Alt key down and now do it, make the mask, and you see that it did that, okay? Or I could have, I'll just leave it at that. That's probably the easiest way to do it. And so now if I look at this, I go to my mask and I see some things that are not as good as I would like right by the windshield and up here and some other stuff, okay? So I can still do things like go back down to the fixed layer and I can keep adding to that mask, okay? So I'm going to just do that. I just added more to it that way. I go back up here, and that was with my magic wand. And now I'm going to hit my eraser again, okay? And by the way, I'm using hotkeys to switch between these, but you can do them a bunch of different ways. You can go click on them. You can do whatever you want. And again, this is the point where I suggest, you know, for any one of these tools, the important point is that you get the name of the tool and then, you know, start playing with it so you get to be good at using it, okay? These aren't necessarily super straightforward and easy all the time, okay? So that's one thing. That's one way to do the mask, okay? And then there's new things that sometimes avoid all that. So I'm going to go through and go back to this layer here. And now notice that on Photoshop, the newest versions of it, if you have a newest version, you have this thing down here where it says, there's a thing down here that says select subject. And I'm going to click it. And this is an AI thing. So it's going to sit there and think. And notice what it did. Look at the selection it made. It did a pretty good selection. And the only thing that's wrong with it is that if you look up here, see how it selected this. And so the blue, it kind of went from here to here to here. So the blue in here is selected and we don't want it to be. And then the blue between the radiator hose and the radiator is selected, and down by the fan belt is selected. And also the blue that's coming through the windows is selected, okay? But other than that, it's actually pretty good. You know, there's some things it missed too, but it's actually pretty good. And so then what we're going to do now is we're going to use some of our other tools to refine this. So if I go through here and I go through and say, now I'm going to go ahead and select something with my magic wand again. And this time I am going to do, so basically, oops, I want to subtract these out. So I click up here to select and change it. So it's subtracting stuff. And then see that it's getting rid of the blue. It's taking that out of the selection. And this may not be perfect. I'm not going to, you know, worry about it right now. But you see the basic idea. I've got this whole mask, okay? And I can make it better later. I'm not going to worry about it. But basically, if you look at this, I've got a mask selected of this car. So now the same kind of thing is if I, one of the other things I was going to say also, since let's say you get to a mask that you really like, or you're working on one and you don't have time to finish it, or any of these other reasons, remember what I said about that a mask is like the hardest thing to recreate, okay? Especially if it's something like this where you have an engine showing and all this other stuff. So basically, one of the things I encourage everybody to do, and this, like I said, this is like very important, is to save your selection. So your selection, in case that way, if something happens, you need to make the mask again or something else, you can. The way you do that, you go up to the menu, you hit select, and then down on that menu, there's a thing that says save selection. And then that comes up, and usually when it's brand new, you just go ahead and hit car, you name it something that makes sense to you, and you hit OK, all right? And then if I ever need it again, I'm going to deselect it right now by hitting Control D. And if I need it back, I can go up to here and say selection and load selection, and then just choose the one that says car, and it's back, okay? And so now I'm going to go ahead and save the entire image. I'm going to hit Control S and save it, or Command S, and it saved the image, okay? And the reason that's also very important is because if you want to save it, now, later on, let's say you close it, or the biggest thing is, let's say you're in the middle of doing this and you haven't saved, and of course your computer crashes or Lightroom or Photoshop crashes. And so then you're in this whole big thing where you don't have much time to do anything and you have to recreate that whole thing, okay? So that's another thing. You want to be able to save that. Okay, and so that the other thing also too is doing rough selections initially isn't a bad idea, because a lot of times before you waste time getting a whole perfect selection, make sure that, you know, the effect you're going to do you even like. So, you know, if you get something close like we did before, and then, you know, you try and say, no, I don't like that at all, and I'm not going to do that. So that whole selection was a waste. Okay. Now, that's one thing. Another thing, let's say you want to do two different things. So I'm going to go ahead and, again, I'm going to get rid of these two. I'm going to go ahead now, and I'm going to make a new selection here. I'm going to make another layer. I'm going to go ahead and deselect this, okay? And then I'm going to make another layer. And then this time I'm going to do something crazy to it, okay? We'll just do something, I'm just going to choose something at random here. I'll use something like Topaz impression, which does like painting effects, okay? And again, this is not necessarily something you're going to necessarily do this exact filter or anything like that. And in fact, you'll probably think it's heresy once you see it. But let's say we do something like this, and I'm going to go ahead and just choose something that's real obvious. Okay, so again, I don't think this is necessarily the best filter or anything like that. I'm not saying it is. But basically, we just did that, right? And one of the things I was going to say is once you've made a selection, you can reuse that same mask either by getting it off the memory one, or you can just very simply, something that already has that mask. If I hold my Alt or Option key down and I put my mouse on that mask, I can drag it down to here. And now I'm using that mask on a different layer. So that means that's why it's worth the work to get your mask right in the first place. Because once you use it, once you have it, you save it, you can reuse it and do whatever you want. Okay. And so, you know, just that's a rough example of it, but hopefully that makes the point. The next thing we're going to talk about is when you're trying to do selections or anything else, don't try to do one whole big thing all at once. You know, if you have the tool to do it, great. But, you know, if you're doing it by hand, do a little bit of it, stop, do the next part of it, stop. Because I've seen a lot of times where I used to do this myself, where I'd be tracing the car, for instance, with, you know, there's better ways to do it, but sometimes there's not. Tracing the car with one of the selection tools. And then I'm almost all the way through it, and I accidentally hit the wrong key, and I got rid of the entire part that I had already done. So it's better to do a little bit of it and then keep adding to it, okay? And that part, again, will save you a lot of grief as you go forward. And again, this doesn't apply just to cars. This goes for everything, okay? So a lot of other things. I'm going to show you a couple other quickie fun things that you can do. Okay, so the next thing is I'm going to show you is something real simple here, a couple real simple ones. So one of the things that is also interesting is if, let's say we have this particular thing right here, okay? And I want to do a couple, I want to just show you something how well this works. If you do the select image, so or select subject, watch this one on this. And notice how it got that pretty much perfect, okay? And so either by inverting or doing whatever, I can go ahead and now do something where I just want to copy just this part. If I do a new layer when I do this, it's going to make a layer that only has just that in it. You see where that is? And then let's say I wanted to do a background replacement or something like that. I could very simply, like this is a garbage one, but I'm just going to put in a new, I'll put in like a new gradient or something. Again, this is stupid, but it makes the point. Okay, so gradient fill, and let's go choose something like, and again, the whole point of this is you can learn how to use actual gradients and stuff later. Okay, but the bottom line on this, forgetting how ugly this is, right now, that was pretty simple as far as doing the fix, okay? Again, doesn't really matter if you're going to do that or not, but it's just like it gives you an example. So try that select subject thing first, and then you can try some of the other selection tools. Okay. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is blending modes. Okay. So I'm going to use the same picture, and I'm going to do something like, I'm going to do something crazy with it. Like, let's say I want to do this. I'm going to go back in. This is another Topaz thing that they don't make anymore called Adjust AI. And one of the things I do a lot of is I use filters that increase the contrast a lot. So like this one here, notice how I got it like this, okay? And we're just gonna go ahead and accept it. But I don't necessarily like the sky that much, okay? So what I'm gonna do is if I sit there and again, go back there, go whatever here and say select subject, okay? So I say select subject, and hopefully it'll do just as well as it did last time. Okay, and then what I'm going to do, make a new layer. And so notice what it did there. It kept just the good part, okay? And then see how that changes? So that's from the filter, but it left the sky the same, okay? And then I can, do a bunch of other tricks like that later, okay? And then a lot of times, let's say, for whatever reason, I'm going to do something a little different now, just to show you something really crazy, or another way to use all this. I'm going to do this filter. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say filter, and I'm going to just this time do something really stupid. You'll see this in a second, but again, it'll illustrate the point really well. And this is Topaz Studio, another thing that they again don't make. And you can do this with any filter though, so it doesn't really matter what you're doing. Let's use this. Okay, and then let's go ahead and say, okay, so now we have this. And let's say I like the effect. I don't really, but let's say I do. And let's say I have, I want to make it so that the color isn't quite so intense, but it still keeps the whole whatever. Okay, so I'm going to make two different levels of this this filter. Okay, and this is what we're going to talk about with blending modes. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to turn this one off. In blending modes, right up here where it says normal, there's a whole bunch of other blending modes, and this is something I encourage you to play with because a lot of these do some really cool things. But if you sit there and go down through them, you're going to see different effects, okay, and changing stuff like that. And the main ones that we want to pay attention to right now are, this is what I call filter splitting. So filter splitting is when you basically take the color from one layer and you take the luminosity from another. So I'm going to do the luminosity on this, okay? So notice that now when the luminosity is there, if I turn it on and off, you see how, again, how what it did to the object, right? It's changing everything, but the color is still the same, okay? And then if I put the color, this one back on here, and I change it just to color, okay, and I turn this one off, notice how now it has the color of everything, but not the effect otherwise, okay? And so now let's say I want to have the color, but not quite as strong. So I have this one, which has my luminosity, this one, which has my color, and then I take this and the fill, you can adjust the opacity of it, okay? And do stuff like this. So that's another thing to be aware of. I do that like all the time where I'll take a filter and I like part of it, but I don't necessarily like the whole thing. And it's easy to do something like that where you just take it, whatever, okay? So far, so good. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to show you another couple of fixes that like on something like this. This particular one right here, what happens, I'm going to go ahead again and make a fix layer on this. Okay. And I'm going to change it and say fixes. Okay. And notice, by the way, if any of your layers are turned off, they obviously have no effect on anything. But one of the things I'm going to do is, like here, you see there's like little reflections and stuff. Ordinarily, anything that you're going to fix, you try to do it first, after you've denoised and opened stuff. And so what I'm going to do, oops, sloppy. I'm just taking, a lot of times this tool here, which is called the patch tool, it's valuable for not only doing patches, but it's also good for selecting stuff. So for freestyle selecting stuff. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do content aware fill, and then voila, no reflection. And then the same kind of thing. You do these a little bit at a time, because if you do them too much at a time, they'll blend in with each other, and you won't get the effect you like. It'll be messier. Let's put it that way. So there's that, and there's that, and then same thing. And then that one's gone. Okay. And that one, notice how it didn't go totally away. See at the very top right here, there's a little bit left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the stamp tool. Okay. And then what you do on the stamp tool is you hold the Alt key down, you select from something, and then you cover it up. Okay. And then deselect that one. And then the same kind of thing, so on and so forth, go through and do the next one. And this one's pretty easy because there's not any really bad or hard reflections on it. And a lot of times in bumpers, there's somebody, I forgot who it was a while back, they entered a picture and they got graded off because there was reflections in the bumper. Well, this is the same technique. You just do stuff like this and keep doing little chunks till you have it looking uniform. And one of the other ways you can do it, so when I'm using the patch tool, instead of doing content aware fill, I can just do this. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. You see it had a little bit of it picked up some of the black, and we don't want that. So I'm going to do Shift F5 again, and it fixed it pretty well. And I'm happy with that, okay? And you see how that's all gone. And again, this is the kind of thing you're going to run into everywhere. This isn't just a car thing, obviously. Other things have reflections or whatever stuff that you don't want in them. This one I'll try doing all at once because it's all kind of attached. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this thing here and drag it over. And then I'm going to take my stamp tool and do that. Except it's not. And sometimes it takes a little more work than I'm doing right here. But at any rate, I could fix the rest of this by doing, stamping. Here, let's Control Shift V. Let's do it from something like this. Okay. And part of it is that the reflection's a little different on one side than it is on the other. And sometimes, like I said, you'll have to play with it a bit, but basically it'll eventually get done. So anyway, that's I won't finish that, but you get the idea. You keep going through that, and eventually it'll end up. Oh, and part of the problem is here. God, I'm stupid. I accidentally hit the opacity on this one on fixes. There we go. The reason it was bad, it was because it was showing through from the layer underneath it. So, okay, so there we go. Now that part's fixed, and so now if we decide we want to do something creative with it, like again, we'll do something, fun. We fixed it from there to there, right? So now we make another layer. We don't screw with our fix. We leave our fixed layer alone in case we need it again later. We might need to come back to it. And so now I go through here, and I'll just pick a filter out of the clear blue sky. It doesn't really matter what. I will just do something actually what we'll do here, I won't do it this way. I'll show you a Nick one this time. And what I'm going to do is do filter, and then you go to Nick color effects, which is still around, and all this stuff's still current. And notice I didn't make an extra filter. I don't need to make an extra copy of the layer here, because what will happen if, okay. And so one of the things I'm just going to do in here, I'm just going to go to recipes. And one of the ones that comes with it is a thing called clarity bump. And clarity bump's a good, just general use one, because watch what it does. Okay, so it did that. And what it did is it basically made it made a look, so to speak, with 3 filters: tonal contrast, brilliance and warmth, and pro contrast. And you can see what it looks like without each one of them. See, so one of the things I don't necessarily like on this particular filter is that sometimes it makes the whites too bleached out. And I know from experience that it's the pro contrast layer doing that. So what I'm going to do is I select the pro contrast part and I go ahead and hit a control point. Okay. And the control point, I'm going to go ahead and hit minus. And when I hit minus, notice what it does. It took out all the bright whites right there. Okay. And again, I'm not trying to teach you exactly how to use control points or anything else, because we could spend a lot of time on it, but you get the idea. So we have that, and I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And then, we have, and like I said, this is a pretty basic modification. This is something you will actually do quite a bit, because a lot of times, especially when you've taken them in raw and they're in some weird light, the contrast is, weird. So it doesn't help very much to do it that way. And so that way you need help to make it, see, that one has a lot more pop to it. Okay. And chances are I should go back and get rid of some of the blacks and some other stuff too, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. You get the idea. Okay. Oh, and also, while we're doing this one too, just to show you again, really quickly, if you're sitting there doing something like, and if I'm using the lasso tool, polygonal lasso tool again, go over here, and then I'm going to do again content aware fill, and look what happens. Boom, that's fixed. Go over here, Control D, over here, D. Again, I hope these lines show up on Zoom. I'm not really sure, but okay, do that, and again, more or less fixed. And then the same kind of thing, you sit there and do stuff like use the spot healing tool and go and do spot. I do a lot of things, like a lot of times I try some of the older pictures, I didn't necessarily do it as much, but now I always like do stuff like this because it doesn't take very much work and it makes the picture look much better. Something like this, like this, like this. Get rid of all these little grease spots that are down here. And as you can see, it really doesn't take all that much time. I haven't 100% made it perfect or whatever. Okay. Same kind of thing. And I just want to show you that once you get good at this, it's not very hard to, get rid of the tags. And again, I'm doing a kind of shoddy job of this, but okay. And then notice how the went away pretty well. And so then I deselect yet my patch tool again, and take this and just drag it into, might have to do it more than once. Anyhow, you get the idea. And so that picture is basically fixed. And then once the fixes are done, run it through something mild. One of my all-time favorite filters of all time. Come on. I'm going to now go to filter, and then this one's a thing called Topaz Detail. And Topaz Detail is like a very mild sharpening contrast color enhancer. And so what happens, I usually use one. There's one in here called Fall One, and what Fall One does is it makes the thing a little. It depends on which one, on different colors, but like it'll give a cast. Like, see, that's summer, gives it a warmer cast. This gives it a little bit of a red cast, believe it or not. And the way you can tell is if I turn it, see how the red's got redder. And also it did sharpen it. See how down here it brightened up. If you look at the hubcap, I'll turn it off for a second. And if you just click on it, it turns it off. And then I let it back on again, and you see that it brightened it up. Okay. But you can do it whatever you want. It's just like kind of thing. But since this is a simple fix, I'm not trying to do anything really crazy with it. And as you can see, it made the whole picture kind of have a little more spark. Okay. And there's a bunch of them in there with different color casts and whatever. But anyway, that's also very simple, right? That was an easy fix. Now I'm going to show a little more complicated one. One of the things I do a lot is a thing called background obfuscation. Okay. So what you're going to have, like, here's some examples, just for instance. I'm not going to show you these how I did them, but background obfuscation is when you just basically do stuff like, okay, here's the real picture, and then that's what the background obfuscated. Now, it doesn't mean you like that effect or anything else, but what you can see is that at the very least, see how here your goal is always to try to make the car pop out from everything, right? Make it make the eyes focus on it and everything else. So I take this car again, shot in crappy light, probably about 2 in the afternoon. A long time. This is an old picture that I got in. I took this 17 years ago. It's hard to believe. And you click here, and now the whole background is obfuscated, and it's not nearly as obvious the car really sticks out more. Okay, so that's an example of it. Here's another example of it. You know, this was the original picture. This is one of my first real heavily edit things. It got a 10 a long time ago at Focus. But at any rate, again, a lot of crazy filters. It uses a thing called flood. I forgot what the name of this filter even is. It's pretty wild considering everything. So it's kind of things you can do that kind of stuff. And so one of the ones I'm going to show you now is a more detailed example of that. So what we're going to do here, we have this car, and you see there's a lot of stuff in the background. And what we're going to do is we're going to introduce like a fake bokeh kind of effect. Okay, so look at this. And this is something, like I said, this technique you can use a lot for a lot of things. And then notice it now. Okay, you see that? And here's that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to open up the finished one because it's just easier. Okay, I'm going to turn off the top layer. And so here's kind of what happens. All right. First thing you need to do, this one, here's what if you look over here, you see that here's our mask, okay? And by the way, with masks, if I right click on it, I can say disable it. You'll see what it looked like without a mask. See that? Everything's blurred out. So basically, what I did is I used a tool. There's a bunch of different ones I have. I have a couple different Topaz ones, and then there's a bunch of couple things in Nik, and a bunch of other ones where you can blur things out. A good one is just using Gaussian blur inside Photoshop itself, even if you have no filter. That's how I used to do this a long time ago before I had all these fun things to play with. Anyhow, I'm going to re-enable that. And so one of the things that happens with this, I went ahead and did that. And to make this selection, as you can tell, is a very complicated selection. I'm going to show you something else here. I'm going to go ahead and add this mask back to the selection, okay? So I'm adding the mask to the selection. So in other words, this is the reverse of making a selection. You made a selection, then you used it to make a mask. Here you're using the mask to come back with the selection again. And as you can tell, this has a lot of detail to it. There's a lot of places where there weren't smooth where you have to go around all sorts of transitions. I did a very, very, very narrow selection at the top of the windshield. I wanted to make sure that the windshield and, behind these two guys, behind the roll bar was left open. There's other things down here. Down here it didn't matter because what I did, this mask, I wanted to only have kind of blend in from here to the top, okay? And so one of the things you also have to be aware of when you're doing this. All right, so let me just show you a couple things. Let's start this. And I'm not going to finish the whole mask because we don't really have the time, but you've seen some of the techniques already. And so Control D, I'm going to unselect it. And if I go back now and just say select subject, let's see what it does. And in this case, it's not going to do as good because it did a pretty good job. But you see, it also got like the roof of this car. It doesn't have all of this car. You see, so it got confused because this is such a complex picture. And the way that thing works, the reason it works so good on the other one, because the other one we had nice, sharp, both color and light contrasts between the hood ornament and the sky. Here we don't. So basically, we could do this and start with it. But we're going to do stuff like, take this and, take that, and I'm going to go here and here and here and here and unselect this guy. Oops. And the way I just do this, I'm just going around him, and my end point has to be where my start point was. Okay, so now he's deselected. This stuff up here, also easy to deselect because it's not really in the picture. Okay. And then same kind of thing, you have to go through. And one of the things I was going to show you, a lot of times if you're trying to see stuff, right now I look at my thing, down over here, there's a thing where you click this on and it shows you, but it's this little thing down here that looks like, again, it's your mask. It turns it on and off. It's a color mask. That's what it's called, color mask. And what it's for is the fact that you can now continue doing your selection, but using an eraser instead of a drawing tool. So I'm going to go ahead and get my eraser. Okay. And then watch what happens here. If I have it that way, it's the wrong way. So I change it, I change it to the other way, and I can start selecting things. And everything I'm erasing right here, erasing through this mask, is ending up going in the selection, right? And also it's easy if you keep, changing your sizes to do certain things. Okay. And again, I'm not going to worry about finishing it, but you get the idea. Go through this and, you know, do some of the easy stuff this way. One of the other things I suggest doing if you have something that's linear, so let me get to something linear here. Like, okay, the part of the windshield here. I go ahead and I'm going to turn this off. There we go. Okay, so now I have to add if I do this, I get my line tool and I add and make sure it's on add instead of subtract, add to selection. And so I go here, down to here, down to here, and up to here. Okay. And so forth. And there's a bunch of ways. And this is, like I said, this is a really hard one. I chose it directly just because I think it shows, you know, what happens kind of thing. Okay. So let's say we did that. And in real life, this is kind of a little more tedious on a picture like this because you have to go through a lot of steps to get it, you know, the selection right. The rest of it's all easy. It's just the selection part that's hard. And again, I'm doing it a very crude. There's all sorts of ways to use these tools in a little more finessed way, but I'm not doing that now because of time. That's where I try to. One thing about this is try not to do too big of selections at once because sometimes it makes it worse, makes it harder because it'll get confused. It'll go crossways, whatever. Okay, let's say that's good enough for right now. Okay, and we saved it and did all the other stuff we're going to do. All right. And what I really did, actually, one of the other things about this too, is in real life, since I know I'm using a blur here, I don't want the foreground blurred. So basically I can go ahead and take pretty much what I did was go like from here to about there, to about there, to about there, down here, and then select all of this, okay? And so now the whole background is selected, okay? And I'm going to save that selection. And notice I already have it. I'm not going to really save it, but see right there, I'd save the upper background. I could go ahead and replace it if I want to. I'm not going to because of the fact that I already have that selection done the right way. All right. So I'm going to do that. Actually, I do want to show you one thing on this. I'm going to go and save it and say new. All right. So I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to deselect it for right now. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a blur layer. Okay. So I'm going to go here. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to probably, here's a good one. I'll just go do plain old Gaussian blur. So this is one that you don't need anything for. It's already built into Photoshop. And if I go into filter and then go to blur, and actually there's an even better one, blur, actually go to blur gallery and do the one that's called iris blur. Okay. And iris blur, you'll see what it does here in a second. There we go. So this is blurring stuff. Do you see how it's doing that? And one of the things with this, I don't necessarily like this particular tool as well as the one I used it for, but I'm going to do this and see the whole thing is pretty much blurred now. Okay. And that's good. I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, on that. All right. And we're good actually. And this is one part, bear with because I don't use it all the time. There we go. Okay. I just hit return and now we're back to where we wanted to be. Okay, and don't worry about the fact this little hole because this part is not going to be blurred anyway. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring back my selection. Okay, so I bring back selection and I'm going to go ahead and load that selection and then load one that is called extra background in this case. Okay, and now I want to erase out of this. Okay. Now watch what happens. I'm going to do this two ways. I'm going to first of all make a filter or make a mask. I'm going to hold my Alt key and make a mask. And one of the problems with this is look how sharp. You can obviously tell this has been faked because if you look at look across where I selected and you can see there's a sharp background there between the beginning and the end. Anyhow, one of the things that you need to be aware of when you're using the eraser and some of these other tools is a thing called feathering and a thing called softness. And so let me do this real quick. I'm going to hit the eraser tool. I'm going to go up here and make this very, very soft. And then I'm also going to reduce the opacity on it. I'm going to go ahead and make it soft first, and I'll do this. And when you do this and make it that soft, watch what happens to the edge. See that? It's kind of like takes that off and makes it. Does everybody see how that works? And so what happened when I did it the real way, and that's a good one. That's an okay one there. But I did it here and you can see it blends out nicely and there's no sharp lines anywhere. And so now the background is obfuscated and it looks cool. And then the other thing about it is on this one, I also made another layer, and this is just to show you adding 2 layers together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my same mask and put it here. Okay. And then this mask up here, I'm going to make it a little more transparent, and that way the other mask will start showing through. And that way you're altering your mask. You're using 2 different masks or 2 different filters at once with the same mask to get kind of a slightly different effect. Okay. And with that, even though like I said, I could keep going on this literally all night, but I will end it since we have to go home. Hopefully you got something out of that. Feel free. You have my email address and whatever. Feel more than free to go ahead. If you saw something here tonight that confused you or whatever, which I'm sure you did, and you want more clarity on it, feel free to do that. And I can call you, help you over the phone, whatever the case may be. So anyway, any last questions?
No, it's very good. Thanks.
Okay. All righty. Well, you guys have fun. Thanks for coming. And
Thank you, Dan.
hopefully you got
Appreciate
something.
it.
Yeah, it's really, really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. And like you said in the beginning, you're going to be putting together a PDF for everybody. It's going to cover a lot of these things.
It'll have a lot
of things that you probably wanted to cover, but we ran out of time. So
there's a lot of it. Like I said, it's the kind of thing you learn over time anyway. But hopefully it'll give you some ideas. And like I said, if you have any questions, specific ones, or maybe there's stuff I didn't cover that you might have questions on, feel free to ask those as well. Okay.
Really appreciate that. Yep.
Okay. Everybody have a safe drive home if you're going home, or stay safe at your house if you're already there.
Thanks, Dan.
Take care, you guys.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you all. Good night.
Night.
Good night.